And the adult content in Grand Theft Auto 5 begs the question, do you know what your kids are playing?
Roblox can be anything but child's play.
A game that allows you to pick up prostitutes and kill them. I don't know if that sends the most family-friendly message.
As a mother, I would just say step away from the screen, go outside, get some fresh air. Beating Tetris is not a life goal.
An artist is making a video game. An artist makes a painting a kid might not like. But should the kid not be able to walk into a museum and look at that piece of art?
Video games? I mean, there are some good bangers that were made 20 years ago, but unfortunately, video games will never be art. Never. And the people that are making games now are just simply not very talented in it. The games that could be considered in a fantastically realized art form were made in 1991, 92, 93, 94.
Video games are art. The second you start following the games industry with any real level of interest, you start hearing that phrase from people in the industry to popular gaming outlets to YouTubers to Jerry. You guys know Jerry. But even though it's always presented as a fact, a firm stance on the merits of video games as a form of artistic expression, it always comes off as a bit of a plea, as if the world rejects this notion and it needs to be asked for, fought for, hell, demanded. The games industry often presents itself culturally to be a bit of an underdog, an underappreciated, misunderstood medium with more to offer than people realize, and while that definitely has some truth to it, it's also not hard to see how that fight for legitimacy is largely self-imposed. Let's talk about the Game Awards. The Game Awards is an annual live show that takes place in early December, recognizing the most outstanding games of the past year, while also teasing future projects from indie studios to AAA giants and everything in between. While the show has had its fair share of criticism over the years and people can often be very dismissive of the event, it's hard to argue against the fact that, especially now that E3 is officially, finally, 100% forever cancelled, the Game Awards is the biggest night for games year in and year out, and its showrunner Jeff Keighley, whether you like him or not, is the closest thing we have to a gaming ambassador. His other main event, Summer Games Fest, seems to be succeeding in the same time frame and general format where E3 failed. He's been part of some of the industry's biggest announcements and managed to snag some of its biggest names, and the attention that his main show has been getting as of late is staggering. It's often been dubbed as the gaming Oscars, but while the Oscars have been bleeding viewership numbers over the last 2 decades, the Game Awards have gained more and more traction, and given its free online live streaming nature, it's been able to easily overtake the Oscars in overall viewership. Sorry, hold on. I feel like I undersold that a little bit. For context, the 2023 Oscars had a live audience of about 20 million people. So when I say the Game Awards easily overtook that, do I mean they had a live audience of 22 million, 25 million, 30, hell, even 40 million? 118 million. So yeah, it's a big deal, but you remember those criticisms I brushed aside a couple of seconds ago? Those are a big deal too. On the low end of the spectrum, you have the complaint that the Game Awards have essentially their own version of Oscar bait, with story-driven, third-person action-adventure games completely dominating the nominations for major awards in any given year. The problem to some people being that games which skew more movie-like are put on a pedestal, while those which are described as more video gamey are seen as lesser. Something that I wouldn't wholly agree with considering some of the notable winners of the last 10 years, but there does seem to be at least a bit of a precedent here, especially from Sony. But harsher critiques include the fact that the actual appraisal and championing of video games is often shelved in favor of pushing hype for the future and throwing a bunch of A-list celebrities in our faces for no reason. That attack is especially hard to defend after the most recent Game Awards. It seems like Chris Judge's 8-minute-long acceptance speech the year before had really been keeping Keighley up at night as images of how many Steam Decks it cost him danced around his head like Vietnam flashbacks, so this time around he severely overcorrected, even admitting as much right after the show, and only gave 30 seconds for award speeches before music would start to play them off. All in all, award speeches from the 3-hour-long award show tallied up to just under 11 minutes, while Hideo Kojima and Jordan Peele talked about next to nothing for 8 minutes by themselves, Anthony Mackie did his worst Keanu Reeves impression for another couple of minutes, and Simu Liu talked about his broken leg for another 2.5. Now, most people tend to accredit this to Keighley's ego, saying that he does it because he wants to show off his famous friends, he wants to show that he's close with Kojima and the Muppets. And look how cool he is because he gets early access to all these trailers, but honestly, I think it's something a little different, although something arguably a lot more damaging. It comes from an insecurity in the industry itself. film and TV are generally more respected than games are at this point in time. That's hard to argue against. They already had their cultural battles in the early to mid 1900s and came out on top. But make no mistake, they did have them. They were criticized heavily in their infancy for not being real art. As games struggle with the same thing, however, it feels like the solution is just to grasp onto any loose strings hanging off these established industries and ride their coattails into mainstream success. It is true that a lot of games have begun to structure their stories and cutscenes in ways that are very reminiscent of film, and while those often end up being some of my favorite experiences, I will admit that it sometimes feels a little bit weird to be playing a video game and not touch your controller for a solid 30 minutes because you're just watching a scene play out. More A-list actors have started voice acting for video games, even though it's undoubtedly more expensive to do so, and often worse than just hiring voice talent, because voice acting and regular acting are two very different things.
I should be sad, but I'm not.
But no, buy our game. It has Matthew McConaughey. And mind you, this doesn't even fall in line with typical video game marketing. Unlike movies, the financial success of games is almost entirely divorced from the actors involved. Who's ever bought a game just because it has a specific voice actor involved? Never mind the fact that the company making the biggest single-player games in the world is consistently hiring voice actors people haven't heard of before. So it seems almost counterintuitive to do something like this. And I know people will point to Keanu Reeves and Idris Elba and Cyberpunk proving this strategy does actually work, but Cyberpunk was overhyped before these guys got involved. We can't really quantify how much they contributed to its success. Show me how much good it did Ghost Recon Breakpoint to feature John Bernthal, or Crackdown 3 to feature Terry Crews, or Fast and Furious Crossroads to star Vin Diesel. You can't. Only one copy of all of those games were sold, and they were then immediately incinerated. Then there's adaptations, which have finally found their footing after years of failed crossovers, and while it's nice for these franchises to reach new audiences, and a lot of them do translate well, it's another connection to established mediums, and it kind of feels like within the gaming community, people act like any franchise that successfully transitions into film or TV have basically made it out of the hood, as if selling tens of millions of copies is equivalent to scrounging up change on a highway. And then there's these moments where Christopher Nolan or Timothy Chalamet are announcing the winners for Game of the Year. I won't even say that this stuff is completely out of left field. In fact, I think Keely's gotten better at least having relevant A-list guests. Jordan Peele is working on a game with Kojima, Mackie was in the Twisted Metal adaptation, Simu Liu is playing a part in Stormgate and seems to be a genuine fan of StarCraft, and Timothy Chalamet had a whole YouTube channel about modding Xbox controllers. Plus he was in Lies of P. These are actual fans and collaborators, and I'll even admit that it can be a little bit validating to see stuff like this. Hey, that guy from that movie I really enjoyed likes strategy games? Cool. Hey, that hot guy plays video games? Maybe I'm hot too. But ultimately, to have an event that's centered around games and then make most of the presenters film actors with a passing connection to games, it feels like the industry cheapening and downplaying its own value and admitting itself as a lesser medium in hopes that they can stand close enough to their famous daddy that people think they're famous too. And while I understand that a lot of the things I've talked about that contribute to this self-delegitimization come from higher-up execs who are just trying to print more money, like the voice acting and the adaptations and the commercials and the imitation, I find it particularly discouraging when a celebration of the medium made by a guy who clearly loves it relies so heavily on this gimmick. I also find it discouraging how the general community continues to act as if it's misunderstood and culturally oppressed, and then just sulks in that feeling, complaining about the people who don't get it. Cause yeah, there's absolutely a truckload of criticism, or worse, blanket dismissiveness of games worldwide, but not only have a lot of negative connotations around the medium been largely tempered, with stuff like the games cause violence movement still being around but losing a lot of steam, and the game addiction concerns still kicking, but also, I mean, that's a real thing, people should be looking into that, but we often ignore just how respected some of these things have become to a wide group of people, or how respected they would become if we unashamedly shared our passion with others. Even in my own life, I can't tell you how many people have actually gained a huge respect for the medium after I talk to them about some of the reasons why I play games, or show them the work that went into my own game projects, or took the time to play something with them. There are a lot of organic ways to, for lack of a less corny phrase, spread the culture. Speaking of culture, game developer Brian Green had an interesting breakdown of what he said were the 3 types of legitimacy, essentially the 3 ingredients that together allow you to say, yes, this is in fact a legitimate medium. And he defines them as financial legitimacy, artistic legitimacy, and cultural legitimacy. Financial needs no no real argument. Video games make just about as much as every other major entertainment industry combined, so let's not waste our time. As for artistic and cultural legitimacy, Brian argued that the former hinges on the self-image of those working in the industry, urging artists and developers to take pride in their own work as being legitimate work. And the latter is in the process of occurring. People from the last few generations have grown up with games, it's not alien to them, and they understand their worth. It's worth mentioning that this article is actually from 15 years ago, and the industry has evolved quite a bit since then, so while I do like this three-pronged argument, some of the opinions might now be a bit outdated. I'd say that the rise of indie gaming has really pushed the idea of this being a fulfilling artistic field that people want to pursue. More than just a stepping stone, it's a final destination, although crunch and high turnover in employees does counteract that a little bit since video game careers last a notoriously tiny amount of time. So whether or not you see it as a stepping stone, it might just end up being one regardless. But I'd also argue that with the first two checked off, the third one kind of has to be true by default. I mean, if you have a truly giant audience and you're attracting talented artists that put their full passion and effort into these products, then what else do you need for cultural relevancy besides maybe a little time? 65% of Americans play games in some capacity, and while not all of them engage with it in the way we typically imagine art to be engaged with, seeing it as just a fun way to pass the time, the same can be said for movies. Statistically speaking, a lot more people watch popcorn movies and rom-coms than The Lighthouse, just like a lot more people play Candy Crush than Rain World. So what's the difference? Is there a difference? Well, yeah, of course. The biggest one I can come up with is that games have a barrier for entry. They often require dedicated or powerful hardware, there are less subscription services which people have become accustomed to for movies and TV, and there's a skill barrier for a lot of experiences too. Like imagine you're sitting there and starting from scratch. No DVDs, no consoles, no Netflix, no Game Pass, no nice computer. It is objectively a whole lot easier to say, hey, let's burn 2 hours at the nearby theater and watch the new movie where Sydney Sweeney is hot and that's the plot. Or rent Netflix for $10 and watch something on your laptop than it is to say, hey, let's go to GameStop, buy a console for $400, buy a game separately for $70, come back, download the game at a significantly lower speed than our internet is supposed to have, start the game, realize it needs an update, wait another hour for the update to download, and do core exercises for our thumbs just so we can manage to sprint in Dark Souls. But this issue will never go away, really. Some games will be more accessible, some services will become more widespread, but an overwhelming amount of the industry will be locked behind some kind of barrier, so what are we waiting for? What do we expect? For everyone to get on the same page about this? That's never gonna happen. Never mind with something this inaccessible. I mean, it's never happened with anything ever. We need to stop conflating culturally relevant with universally accepted. Case in point, hip-hop is the biggest music genre in the world. It's full of highly influential artists, has made its way into pop music. Hip-hop artists have won tons of mainstream awards, including Pulitzer Prizes. Does that mean it's universally accepted?
This is why I say that hip-hop has done more damage to young African Americans than racism in recent years.
No, the hip-hop is not and has never been remotely close to universally accepted, but you'd have to be brain dead to think it doesn't have significant cultural relevance. It's also, unfortunately, a really good demonstration of a significant internal divide that pops up when people obsess over this idea of needing to prove something's legit. People complain about modern mumble rap just like they complained when rappers did too many collabs with pop stars, just like they complained when Kanye was rapping in a pink polo. It all backs this idea that there's the sophisticated side of things and then there's the dumb popular sellout stuff, and the more obsessed you become with that idea, the more you become embarrassed of the thing you love. And if that builds up enough, you essentially make it impossible to gain the acceptance you want from others because the people vying for that acceptance are all turning their noses up at each other. This feels like a big reason why comic books spent so long being considered juvenile. Nowadays they're definitely more accepted than they were before, but the general public still sees them as being for kids, even with their close affiliation to multi-billion-dollar movies. And part of that, I think, is that internally a lot of people will make this distinction between comics and graphic novels, even though most people can't even agree on what defines a graphic novel, especially nowadays. One of the more accepted definitions is that a graphic novel is something that's packaged a little bit more book-like, it tells larger stories, and issues are more like chapters than mini, partially self-contained stories, basically like the difference between a serialized and non-serialized TV show, but secretly everyone knows that a lot of people say graphic novel when they're too embarrassed to say comic book. Apparently graphic novels are the gritty, serious adult stories made by the well-known writers, and comic books are the little kiddie stuff with superheroes, which, if you're into comics at all, doesn't really track. Neil Gaiman, author of Coraline, The Sandman, and American Gods, easily one of the most prolific, not just comic writers, but writers of the last few decades, has a really great quote about this. It's a little bit long, but I mean, you made it this far already. What are you gonna do, leave? I was kidding. Once, while at a party in London, the editor of the literary reviews page of a major newspaper struck up a conversation with me, and we chatted pleasantly until he asked what I did for a living. I write comics, I said, and I watched the editor's interest instantly drain away as if he suddenly realized he was speaking to someone beneath his nose. Just to be polite, he followed up by inquiring, "Oh, yes? Which comics have you written?" So I mentioned a few titles, which he nodded at perfunctorily, and I concluded I also did this thing called Sandman. At that point, he became excited and said, "Hang on, I know who you are. You're Neil Gaiman." I admitted that I was. "My God, man, you don't write comics," he said. "You write graphic novels." He meant it as a compliment, I suppose, but all of a sudden I felt like someone who'd been informed that she wasn't actually a hooker, that she was in fact a lady of the evening. This editor had obviously heard positive things about Sandman, but he was so stuck on the idea that comics are juvenile that he couldn't deal with something good being done as a comic book. He needed to put Sandman in a box to make it respectable. What sucks is that while that story is about somebody who doesn't care for or respect comics in the slightest, the same kind of attitude has been pervasive throughout comic fandom for over half a century. And I think Gaiman's attitude on it all is so refreshing compared to even a legend like Stan Lee, who admitted that at first he was embarrassed to be writing comics. Gaiman had enough security in what he did and what the medium was that he had no issue calling what he wrote comics, even though people considered that to be lesser. He didn't try to twist it into something more appetizing for someone else's sake, and I personally find that to be pretty inspiring as somebody who still hesitates when I tell people I want to work as a game developer. I think a lot of us, even those that like to act like they're above all this, have a level of insecurity with the things we enjoy, which leads to a lot of gatekeeping, a lot of bargaining that, no, we don't like the lame stuff, we like the cool stuff, and a lot of self-doubt, which then feels like more people are doubting us than they actually are. But the thing is, if we keep acting like our medium needs to be handled with kitty gloves, the world will keep treating us with them, and we'll be stuck in the same place we've always been. Comics are taken a bit more seriously now, especially after the MCU, proving that writing the success of another medium can be beneficial to an extent, but considering how much artistry comics take and how long they've been around, that acceptance isn't nearly as far along as it should be, and it serves as a bit of a cautionary tale in this whole fight for legitimacy. There's also no banner that unfurls to recognize that you're now more legitimate. There's no flip that gets switched and lets everyone know, hey, take this thing seriously now. So we need to stop waiting for that to happen and just stand by our own interests for our own reasons. At the top, that means we need to stop putting so much stake in and frothing at the mouth at celebrity cameos. We need less of that at these shows, and I hope Keeley recognizes that. To that end, I will say that it was really nice to see a strictly video game voice actor win Best Voice Acting this year instead of giving it to the biggest name on the list, Idris Elba. I'm glad the panel of judges didn't just bend to his gravitational pull, even though he put in a good performance from what I've seen. And then for us, we need to stop complaining that games need to be taken seriously and pretending we're fighting some uphill battle and that, hey, games are art. They are. It's obvious to people who are shown it in the correct light. We don't have to fight for people to see it that way, we just need to introduce it to more people. My dad didn't play a real video game till he was 50, and then I showed him some of my favorites, and he gets it. He sees the appeal. Will I catch him late at night playing Warzone with the boys? Probably not, but he thought slamming demon heads in Doom was pretty good dumb fun, so I'll take it. Some people will never budge, but at that point, I mean, it's their loss. What, you don't want to have fun? Okay, more fun for me, I guess. Man, what a tragic ending. There's always going to be people who won't understand or directly oppose the games industry. There'll be plenty of news stories in the near future of people freaking out over what GTA 6 is teaching kids, and even more news anchors downplaying a huge achievement from a young kid by telling him to go outside. That'll always happen no matter what. But we are clearly not the underdogs. We aren't lacking in talent and artistic expression and financial success, and so I genuinely don't believe we're fighting for legitimacy. In fact, in some ways, by framing it the way we do, we're holding ourselves back from it.
I'm the last person I would have suspected, but I was looking for me all the time. It's the perfect crime.
I think what I'm trying to say is stop insecure gaming and start Neil gaming. Thank you. I'll be here all night.